There we go. All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Tetrault, and I'm the executive director at Wabash and Erie Canal Park in Delphi. As Claire said, I do want to get it out of the way up front that I am not a professional historian. I started working at Canal Park a few years ago to manage the park and its services, but I just couldn't help but being sucked into canal history because I just found it so interesting and so incredible. So you're really getting the B team tonight. Don't Google search anything I tell you. I promise it's true to the best of my ability. I am not the foremost expert on Indiana's canal history. There are many avid historians with the Canal Society of Indiana, with our park, who have devoted decades of their lives to researching this stuff, and I've been learning a lot from them along the way. I want to give a special thanks to first Bob and Carolyn Schmidt with the Canal Society of Indiana. A lot of their research and materials were super helpful in finding very specific information about Lafayette's canal story. I want to thank Tom Castaldi, Allen County historian. He also has written some really great accounts of the canal story. I want to thank, well, I don't know if I'm allowed to thank my own organization, but I want to thank them anyway. There's a really great archives department with a lot of great primary sources. And then, of course, I want to thank TCHA for giving me the opportunity to come here this evening. I got to go down to the basement of this building and look through some of the boxes of all the things they found during the railroad relocation. It was so cool. It was like so much fun. It was like a kid in a candy store. And thankfully, your staff is also history nerds, so they didn't think I was weird. So I appreciate them very much. So tonight we want to do a few things. First, I want to look at Indiana's overall canal context with you before we zoom into Lafayette. What was this canal? Why was it built? How did it work? Why did it close? Those are all important questions to know before we dive into Lafayette. I also want to talk about how the Wabash and Erie Canal did play a crucial role in transforming Lafayette into the vibrant city we know and love today. Third, if we have time, I may have to skip around a bunch. So I'm the son of a pastor, and he's long-winded, and so am I. So I'm going to have to maybe skip around a little bit. Just forgive me if that takes place. But I'd like to take a look at a particular canal boat captain's wild ride coming through Lafayette. It's kind of fun to see those firsthand accounts to get an idea of what life was like on the ground. And lastly, I'd like to share about how you can get involved with canal history today. So if you hear these stories and you think it sounds interesting, you have a lot of opportunities to dive deeper after this evening. So let's start off with Indiana as a whole. If you have any questions, we will do a Q&A for the last 15 minutes or so. And I find that a lot of people don't have a whole lot of canal knowledge pre-existing. So I'm going to lead off with the same three questions I ask the fourth graders when we go through the museum. Question number one, you don't have to answer out loud. You can just think it in your head. Question number one, how did you all get here tonight and how far did you travel? Most likely you came via car, maybe bicycle. You may have come dozens of miles to get here, and yet you all look fresh as spring chickens, so comfy, ready to learn and have fun. That tells me that we're really good at moving people in a relatively comfortable way today. Question number two, how many of you have purchased something in the past month or the past week online? Then, of course, the kids, of course, they just say, my mom spends way too much. And it's like, whoa, 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 cool it, kid. Let's not out anybody here. But everyone has probably ordered something online relatively recently. And as a follow-up, how do you feel when that box is not on your porch within 48 hours? Maybe anxious, maybe grumpy, maybe angry, who knows? Well, that tells me that we're really good at moving stuff in a pretty efficient and pretty fast method. And then the last question, what would your life be like if you could only safely, reliably travel to places within walking distance? What would your life be like if you could only purchase things that were fabricated or grown from scratch within walking distance? And most of the kids look around and they think, I've never thought of life that way before. And that's what we're here for. So that's the context that this canal comes into. In the mid-1800s, Indiana built the second longest transportation canal in human history. It was called the Wabash and Erie Canal because it linked the Wabash River to Lake Erie, Wabash and Erie. At its full length from Toledo, Ohio down to Evansville, it was 468 miles long. Imagine doing that by hand, digging a 40-foot wide, 4-foot deep ditch. That's a lot of digging. It's a marvel of engineering. It's a miracle that it ever got built. It operated from the early 1830s through the 1870s. By 1874, we say it was practically closed. Starting in 1843, you could actually hop on a boat here in Lafayette and travel to New York City entirely by water, and not the cheater's way of floating down to New Orleans. You would actually float up the canal to Lake Erie, switch boats, go across the Lake Erie, switch boats, go across the Erie Canal in New York State, float down the Hudson River, and there you are in New York City Harbor, ready to go anywhere in the world entirely by water from the Midwest. And most importantly, for tonight's purposes, is this incredible structure ran right through downtown Lafayette, just 5 blocks, whatever direction the river is from where we are. Thank you. All right, appreciate it. Exactly. So I'm here tonight because I believe that the Wabash and Erie Canal is a really misunderstood and underappreciated part of Indiana's history. If you read books about American canals, and I know you've all done that in the last week, so, but just for the people on Zoom, if you read a U.S. canal history book, it goes something like this. You start off with some early fledgling attempts in the East to build canals, didn't really work. And then comes the Erie Canal in New York. And oh my goodness, the Erie Canal was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And it totally changed the country. And that's all true. It was successful. And then it's like, oh my gosh, this author and the Erie Canal should get a room because half of the book is just the Erie Canal. Well, and then they talk a little bit about Ohio, Pennsylvania, other eastern states. And then at the very end, there might be maybe a paragraph, maybe a sentence that says something like, the absolute worst attempt at ever building a canal was in Indiana. It was a total fiasco, a huge waste of money. Nobody benefited from it, and it was a huge loss. The end. And that's not fair. I don't think that's fair. I hope to convince you this evening that the Wabash and Erie Canal was, in fact, a huge success for cities like Lafayette. I hope to show you that the labor of thousands of immigrant laborers, the strivings of the entrepreneurs and the farmers of this region, all the work, the attempt to build something special with limited technology, I hope that would serve as an inspiration, but also a testament to what can be done, along with, okay, maybe some lessons of what not to do next time. All right, a few common questions we get that I can just get out of the way. First thing, what is a canal? It is not a river. It is an artificial structure that moves water in a very controlled fashion. There's a very, very slow current, usually about 1/4 mile an hour or slower. So you'd have to dig very carefully to get that speed. So you could pull both directions with a mule-pulled barge. So you can almost think of a canal like a really big staircase. You got a mostly straight section, a drop, straight section, drop. Next question people ask, well, why didn't you just use the river? I mean, you've got the Wabash River, gets just about to Fort Wayne, and the Maumee River gets just about to the same place. Just use the river. Well, here's the problem. The canal goes up and over the Continental Divide. Rivers do not do that. They are only gravity powered. So the elevation is one problem. Secondly, rivers have currents. They've got dry season, you got flooding, you got rocks, sandbars, all that stuff. The Wabash is really great for steamboats up to Lafayette. Beyond that, you're starting to roll the dice. Getting to Delphi, maybe. Getting to Logansport, maybe by an act of God. So the river was seriously limiting for commerce going both directions. And then, of course, the classic one, well, why didn't they just build a railroad? That's what I would have done. Well, here's the problem. When these decisions were all being made in the 1820s, steam locomotives did not exist in the United States. And they weren't available in Indiana for close to a couple decades more after that. So that's some of the common questions we get. There you go. That's the Q&A section all done already, actually. So in the first half of the 1800s, the US built 4,400 miles of canals. That's a lot of mileage. Now, Indiana was not alone to build a canal network. New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Connecticut, the canals were everywhere. It was seen as the way into the future. What's pretty incredible is that the Wabash and Erie Canal, the one that ran right through downtown Lafayette, was over 10% of the entire nation's mileage. Holy cow. And other states, just like Indiana, put themselves in debt. that's the way of the world. For scale, I like to tell people, if you were to dig a ditch starting here in Lafayette and you went a straight south, just start digging a canal 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, 468 miles would get you to Birmingham, Alabama. That's a really long way to be controlling water and digging a ditch. So how did the canal operate? Well, the boats were basically just floating barges that would be pulled along by mules or horses with a long rope, a couple 100 feet long or so. The boats were flat bottom. They could carry 80 to 100 tons of goods, and that's a lot of stuff to fit on a boat. And people think, how could mules pull something that heavy? Well, it's the miracle of physics and water. In Delphi, where we are, our boat weighs about 23 tons, and I bet just about anybody in this room could grab a rope and walk our boat like a dog. At first, it would feel like it's not moving, and then it starts to inch along, and then it's moving, and pretty soon you're expending almost zero effort to walk a 23-ton boat along the canal. It's really incredible how physics will work. The boats themselves were up to about 80 feet long. They were about 14 feet wide. Why is that? Because the lock chambers that would raise and lower the boats, they were 90 feet long and 15 feet wide. So the bigger you could build the boat, the more stuff you could put on it, the more money you could make. Now, some boats would carry people and mail. They were a little smaller, a little faster. They were called packet boats. This is not a packet boat. Other boats were more geared towards carrying cargo, like agricultural products, building materials, food, drink, and by drink, I mean whiskey. But as far as the packet boats are concerned, a common thing to think about is Indiana packet boats could go about 100 miles a day. We were among the fastest passenger service canals in the nation. And you might ask yourself, is it because we built the best boats? No. Is it because our canal was the best engineered? Also no. It was because nobody lived here and there was no traffic. You could just go. You didn't have to wait. Plus, we had lots of nice, straight, flat sections because this is Indiana after all. So you didn't have to wait for the locks to fill up and empty out of the water. You could make from Lafayette to Toledo in a blazing fast, hold on to your hats, 56 hours. Now, that's a lot faster than any other method at that time. So all these boats, like I said, they only moved the pace of a walking mule team. So an easy way to think of a canal is it's like a 19th century interstate highway or a trucking industry. It gets stuff where you want it to be. It increases the quality of life. Now, how was the canal built? Well, it's primarily through immigrant labor, mostly from Ireland and Germany. In fact, even Lafayette still has a lot of Irish and German influence. The work was extremely difficult, very dangerous, but the average worker, by moving from Ireland, where opportunity was scarce, to the United States to work on the canals, even as a laborer, they could expect to see their income effectively tripled. So you can see why it was a risk, but it was still an opportunity for something new. The work took 21 years to finish, 1832 to 1853. All right, now I'm going to try to give you a very quick overview of the timeline to give you a span of the 1820s to 1870s. And this is where I get bogged down sometimes. So here we go. In the 1820s, there was a huge drive in Indiana for we need internal improvements. There were very few effective roads to speak of. Railroad was not a thing, no canals yet. People were like, we need help. 1825, the Erie Canal in New York gets done, and all of a sudden the word starts spreading. Canals are the way of the future. If you don't have one, your state's going to get left behind. And so New York State is seeing profits rolling in. They're seeing their investment recouped year by year, and other states start copying that model. Indiana's feeling that pressure, even though it's a very young state. Now, to put a carrot out in front of Indiana, U.S. Congress says, we'll give you 500,000 acres. You can take those acres, you can sell those acres, and you can keep all the money you make from it to fund a canal. You have to make a canal. That's the deal. That's the stick part of this equation. And Indiana says, okay, let's do it. The spoiler alert, the legislature of Indiana was even more disorganized then than it is now. And they spent 5 years arguing. And all of a sudden, here comes the deadline. With literally weeks before the deadline, a very pompous delegation is sent out to Fort Wayne to turn the first shovelful of dirt, and they declare that they begin construction on the Wabash and Erie Canal. Now, there are no construction plans, there are no contracts signed, but they need to start the construction to make the deadline. And there you go. That's 1832. The canal starts just before the deadline, so Indiana can keep the land and sell it. So that's 1832, a very rocky start, very slow progress to get started until 1836. Oh, I forgot one of my favorite facts. When they started that construction, word spread. Everyone along this valley, we're going to have a superhighway in our backyard any day now. This is so exciting. In Lafayette, one of the partiers got so excited, he shot off his own hand. I'm assuming alcohol was involved because alcohol is involved in basically every story I'm going to tell you tonight. But you can see there was a jubilation across the whole line because the future was coming. And then in 1836, a few years in, the canal's just like a little regional thing, just kind of barely crawling along. Indiana signs something called the Mammoth Internal Improvements Act. It authorizes the state to take, it ends up being about $15 million in debt. It's chump change. Well, not back then, it was a big deal. But the idea was we're going to build a network across the whole state. We're going to have a central canal that runs through Indianapolis. We're going to have the Whitewater Canal that runs down to Cincinnati. We're going to build turnpikes. We're going to build the Madison Railroad, which is different than what we think of as railroad, but it was still a lot of ideas all put on the table. Let's just build everything all at once. What could possibly go wrong? Well, with this $15 million debt, Indiana's collecting less than $50,000 a year in all taxes combined. And just try to take your $50,000 salary and buy your $15 million dream home and see how that turns out for you. So in the late 1830s, a big financial panic, the economy melts down and the money dries up. The Whitewater Canal is abandoned. The Central Canal is abandoned. And all the canal eggs go into the Wabash and Erie basket. And the reason is they've got a steady water supply. They've got a solid survey running all the way down the line. All right, as I said, 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep. They've taken out this huge debt, and now we're in the 1840s, and we start having some hopeful developments along the way. The canal reaches Lafayette in around 1840. In 1843, it reaches Toledo, Ohio. Some people get confused about that. Remember, they started at Fort Wayne, up at the summit, and they dig downhill both ways. So 1840, they're over here. 1843, they finally get to Toledo, Ohio, and now we have access to Lake Erie. To give you an idea of how revolutionary this was, the canal reached Terre Haute around 1849. The population doubled within 2 years. The canal receipts in the 1840s began to pay for the maintenance. It's actually turning a profit. It wasn't paying off the debt, forget that, but at least it's paying off the maintenance. So there's some hope there. And then in the early 1850s, that's where the peak was really reached for canal operations. Between 1830 and 1850, Indiana's population just about tripled from 350,000 to 1 million people. And that's all before a single steam locomotive had arrived in the state. Even more striking, these canal adjacent counties here, in 1830, they counted 12,000 people, grand total in all the canal adjacent counties. By 1850, that population was at least 150,000 people. So imagine I've seen higher numbers, higher estimates than that. I'm going to keep it the lowest one just to be safe. But imagine your population increases by a factor of over 10. That is a lot of new families. It's a lot of new businesses, new farms. It's a huge change. Well, that felt good. Now we're ready for the downhill because the canal reached Evansville in 1853 just in time to meet the steam locomotives. At that point, trains kind of became the dominant technology and the canal business dropped off steadily. 1860s and 70s, it was kind of a long, slow burn of steady decline. Indiana just found itself better served by railroads. That's just how technology goes. Locomotives were faster, they were increasingly safe, increasingly comfortable. The railroad did not shut down in the winter months. The canal had to because the water froze, of course. So just as the canal had unrolled itself like a scroll down to Evansville, by the 1860s, it had begun to roll itself back up. As sections fell into disrepair, oh, that's cut off, that's cut off, that's cut off. And by 1874, it was basically out of service for regular use. So that was the overall story of the canal. What happened to it after that? Well, it was sliced up and diced up. It was sold off as individual parcels of land, left to its own devices, or it became railroad. or it became highway. It just kind of just was forgotten, was largely lost. Okay. Now, let's zoom into Lafayette. How did Lafayette figure into this story? First of all, you're going to see some illustrations tonight from Sean Lutz. Check him out on Facebook, Lutz Works. He's a really good artist, but he also really cares about history and getting details right. So check him out. So pre-canal Lafayette, what was it like? Well, it was extremely isolated. It had basically no useful roads to anywhere. It was basically what you're left with is wheel tracks wandering through the mud in the wet weather. Traveling to a remote destination like Indianapolis, crazy. If you were trying to get all the way to Indy, it was a downright hazard. You were almost taking your life in your hands. The likely result is you get your wagon hopelessly stuck. You'd spend a night in the woods, maybe two. You'd trudge the final miles, likely on foot, because you'd have to lug your cargo and pray you're headed in the right direction. Lafayette was a very isolated place as far as land travel was concerned. There was some hope for the future. John Scott, a journalist, wrote in 1826 when Lafayette became the county seat. He said, Lafayette will greatly benefit from the Grand Canal that will at no distant day form the most convenient link between the Northwestern Great Lakes and the lower Mississippi. So there was hope for a canal even before it had started construction. There was a degree of trade in Lafayette. It was all dependent on the river. Paul Fatute, he was a Purdue professor. He wrote, Lafayette was neither handsome nor cityfied, but it was energetic and aggressive. I don't know if you ever caught the aggressive nature of Lafayette. Historical accounts talk about steamboats that would come from Cincinnati and elsewhere all the way up to Lafayette. So that indicates there's some river commerce going on. So when there were no effective roads, the river was the key to Lafayette's success. Now, the architecture was rudimentary. The culture was pretty ragtag. We're talking a rough river town, okay? This is not where the genteel people go to live. Fatute wrote that when the canal was starting in Fort Wayne in 1832, Lafayette was, and I quote, a nondescript clutter of log cabins and shacks, besides a number of frame houses, several hotels of dubious merit, and a two-story courthouse on the square. The streets, if you could even use that term for them, was basically cow paths littered with stumps, littered with, the products of animals. It would alternate between a dusty mess that would clog your lungs and a muddy swamp that you would get stuck in. Imagine the hogs and the cattle wandering through the streets aimlessly, flies everywhere, the odor of the animals and their byproducts, and decaying garbage floating in the air. Suddenly, it feels like a much different place. In the 1830s, there was a visitor from New England who came through. He commented, Lafayette was very raw. It's not nearly as ordered and picturesque as our cities back home in New England. He commented that the inhabitants were a little off-putting. He said, the women, their hands and faces and apparel are so filthy, they appear disgusting to me. Okay. So at this time, detractors, the haters, would refer to Lafayette as lay flat or laugh at. When the term Star City was coined, an Indianapolis editor even joked that such a remote place could only be a fixed star of the 6th magnitude. Now, if you're not an astronomy nerd, a star of that magnitude is basically invisible to the naked eye. It's not a star at all. Now, that begins to change when the canal arrives in the city. The first boat came to Lafayette around 1840 here. It was scheduled to arrive for a huge political rally for the Whig Party. Now, I know it's election season, but we can all agree the Whigs are the worst. The boat was coming from Delphi. I have no opinions about the Whigs, by the way. Don't come after me if you're part of their caucus. Now, the boat ran aground about a mile outside of Lafayette, and the passengers, that there was a military band aboard. So they got the military band all get off the boat, and they're marching through the mud with their pipes and their drums going to attend the rally. And then later in the year, several boats were actually able to really officially make the whole trip. What's up with the delay? Why did they run aground? Well, guess what? When you get up here in this area, the soil starts to get pretty gravelly. And with that, the water goes right through like a colander. And so it was really hard to keep enough water in the canal to keep the boats floating. And so what they had to do was, so they'd empty it out, and they'd actually just take mule teams and attach like brush or treetops to the backs of the mules by a rope and they'd have the mules walk up and down, up and down. It was called puddling. You just drag the mud back and forth to make like a hardening, watertight layer on the canal. So it took a lot of that, and eventually it worked. Now, the first boat to get to Toledo and back to actually, make it over the Continental Divide, that would be the Albert S. White. Here's a newspaper description of that boat. It says the Albert S. White of Lafayette is a new and superb canal packet. Remember, that's the passenger boat. Built at this place for the Wabash and Erie Canal Transportation Company. She was to leave port yesterday to Fort Wayne, there to receive her furniture, and we venture the opinion that when fitted out, she will take the shine off of anything in her line to be met in these diggins. I don't know what all that means. I'm going to assume it means this boat's really nice and it's very fancy. It goes on. She is commodious, and her apartments are so arranged as that there can be no danger of indiscriminate mingling up of male and female passengers and crew, as is sometimes necessarily the case in boats of bad construction. So this would have been in 1843, a few years on, when the canal, you could actually take this all the way up to Lake Erie. A little background, Albert S. White, by the way, it's not just a random name. He served as a representative and senator for Indiana. He's buried actually in Greenbush Cemetery during the 1828 and 29 legislative session. This is just a fun fact. This is not a canal fact. Albert S. White reported on the proceedings of the Indiana legislature, the first time that had ever been done. He was the first original C-SPAN, and he came from here. Who would have thought? All right, let's talk about some economic impact. There was a movement in Lafayette from subsistence farming to cash cropping, because guess what? You could grow and ship all you wanted. The more you grew, the more money you made. Previously, there was no reason to get much of an agricultural surplus, because once your silos are full, once your storehouses are full, what are you going to do with it? You're not going to sell it to your neighbor. They're growing the same stuff. You can't ship it anywhere because it's too expensive and too dangerous. But now all of a sudden, the more you can grow, the more you can make. The major products back at that day were like things like corn, wheat, pork, etc. There was a movement from a bartering economy to a cash economy because cash was flowing. An average farmer, if you were living and the canal all of a sudden opens up, overnight, you could see your income double for the same crops because you could ship them further to further markets. At the same time, you would see your shipping costs be reduced by 90%. Imagine what that does to somebody looking for a place to start a farm. Land was cheaper in Indiana because it wasn't as crowded as New York, and you can actually make money out there. Stearns Fisher, he was the commissioner for operations east of Lafayette on the canal. He reported to the Indiana Senate in 1843. He said, although this is the first season since its entire completion, its beneficial influence has been widely felt, not only in enhancing the price and furnishing a ready cash market for every species of the surplus products of the soil, but also in enabling consumers of salt, merchandise, etc., to obtain those articles at greatly reduced prices. So you can sell stuff for more money and you can buy stuff for less money because you can get it shipped. So there are a lot of economic benefits there. When we look at the social advances, in 1843, Lafayette's population was 2,600. In just 7 years, it was about 6,100. That's about tripling. Or was that right? No, more than doubled. Sorry, my math is wrong. But it became the fourth largest city in the state. And that's quite a turnaround when we think about the muddy roads and the animal droppings and the smells that were there before. And all of this is happening before a single steam locomotive reaches Lafayette. Now, even if Lafayette was not a cultural icon with all the finer trappings, it's probably because its citizens were more concerned with making money. One visitor commented that all he heard about, all the conversations were about corn and the canal. The town had about 40 stores, commissioned merchants, and other business firms. So it was really a mercantile place to live. And here's what I think is really cool, that Lafayette outperformed Fort Wayne on canal tolls more often than not. Lafayette was a smaller city. It was further in on the canal route. It did not have that prime spot on the Continental Divide, and yet Lafayette still pulled in more tolls. Even when there was a break in the line, some maintenance was needed, so they couldn't get boats here, it still outperformed Lafayette more often than not. One side thing I do want to mention, in 1862, so this is way on, okay, this is way far on, but in 1862, a steam-powered canal boat was built in Lafayette, not mule powered, steam powered, and it made the trip to Toledo. And it was way faster than mule boats, but they were never allowed to run it again. Does anybody, can you guess why? What do you think? It washed out the canal banks. It created big wakes, and then it washes out the banks, and it creates problems for other people. So they never got to use it again. But that shows you Lafayette has always had the most brilliant engineers. So that's been a tradition a long time. All right. Now, the Lafayette Free Press wrote of the social status of Lafayette. It said, the religious and moral character of our citizens, we believe, compare with that of any other place of equal population. A translation is that Lafayette was just as shady as every other river town. Brawls and cracked skulls were so common in this era, and they were so frequent, the legislator actually tried to establish a boatman's infirmary, which would be, obviously servicing the wounds of the canal boat people. And it would be supported by a tax on boat crews. But the tax was too difficult to collect, and the project died. And thus, the canal people would self-medicate at saloons like George Ten Eyck's Exchange at the foot of Main Street, or the City Saloon advertised the purest imported liquors and cigars that will heal what ails you for sure. Hoyt's Hacienda in Lafayette offered something that will refreshen both body and mind. The local media rarely reported on fights, the noisy drunken disturbances, probably because they were too routine. One account, though, of an altercation between two gentlemen. I love they called them, gentlemen, of course. One of them, quote, took occasion to stop the other jaw from moving by breaking it short off, by kicks and other rough usage, whilst the head of his opponent lay upon a log. That's a rough town. Another describes a man who drunkenly wandered out of a saloon onto the canal bank. He walked right across the stern of a docked boat and then splash right in the canal. This was on a late November night. So you can imagine how warm it must have been for him. To be fair, some Lafayette citizens did believe the town would be better off without a canal. They believed that it was bringing a greedy, shady element. But in the end, the canal still remained because it made a lot of money, it kept prices down, and it brought up the quality of life. Speaking of quality of life, let's talk about some of the tycoons and the architecture that the canal brought through the area. All right. So again, once the canal reached Lake Erie, Lafayette really exploded as a bustling port on the canal. If we look at Moses Fowler, he was John Purdue's associate until he went into business solo in 1844. He became a leading wholesaler and a retail grocer and became, of course, a multimillionaire. So with the steamboat navigation, with canal navigation, he could service clients over 100 miles away, something that never would have been possible just over land. When he built his classic Gothic revival house in the early 1850s, he hired Italian artists to do the work. He brought them in from New York via the Erie and then the Wabash and Erie Canal. So he got involved in a lot of different stuff. And, we go from a river town with the shacks and the mud to we're bringing in Italian artists across the country to work on our houses. That is quite a jump. The next one, of course, I'm sure you know this name, John Purdue. He came to Lafayette in 1839, right before the canal arrived. Even after his partnership with Fowler, Purdue goes on to become a multimillionaire in the dry goods wholesale business. That means he's shipping stuff. The canal, again, becomes a source of wealth. So he became a multimillionaire. In 1845, he was doing so well, he builds this business block in Lafayette. It had 12 business spaces, with businesses selling everything from boots to ready-made clothing, which was rare at that time, to hardware. And here's what I think is really incredible. It was said to be the largest brick business house west of New York City. That includes Cincinnati. That includes a whole lot of cities that are a lot bigger than Lafayette. And yet the money coming through this city builds larger structures. There's a plaque describing the building. If you want to go check it out, it's still there today, of course. Now, John Purdue was very active in funding education locally. He financed a bridge across the Wabash River in 1847. And he granted, as you well know, $150,000 to founding Purdue University, making sure his name is on it, of course. And as you probably know, they opened up with 39 students initially, but they've done pretty well for themselves since then. Now, was John Purdue, was he ruined when the canal closed? Of course not. There are tons of stories of tycoons in this era who they start with the canal and they're smart. They can read the room. They adapt to changing technology. So he had a very diverse portfolio and he went on to great things. But I would want you to, for a second, imagine a Lafayette where John Purdue does not have a superhighway running through downtown, allowing him to ship and receive goods from miles and miles and miles away. Why did the railroads come to Lafayette? Because there were businesses here. It's because there was a thriving economy here. It's because there were people here. So I'm wondering if the canal had not been built, would Purdue University even be here? Now, might be audacious. I don't know. You can come argue with me later. I like to think that the canal gave that initial shove to Lafayette's economy, an environment to produce an environment where a land-grant university could thrive. Okay, let's go through real briefly. We do have some examples around town where you can see canal era architecture still evident. These photos came from Sean Lutz again. We got the Samuel Johnson House on Ferry Street. You can see even other structures where you have roof lines where they are older canal era structures that have obviously been built upon. So the architecture of this era still holds strong today. We're going to look at, well, I won't be getting into the mills very much, but they had several mills throughout the canal. And how did this work? Is they would build like bypasses to the canal to funnel water around the side. They would then rent out water rights to merchants who could operate a mill, use that water that's already flowing to turn a wheel, to operate machinery. So it's an early form of hydropower and industry. Well, so basically here's where they're located on the downtown map. They made different things. For the sake of time, I'm going to keep going though, just to be as brief as possible. Let's go through the route of the canal through Lafayette. And again, I'm going to speed through this if I can. So you'll notice that the canal is operating on the south side of the Wabash River. North of Delphi, the canal's on the north side of the Wabash River. They actually crossed right across the river with some engineering that I don't have time to get into. But long story short, the canal for all this Lafayette area is on the south side of the river. So if you know somebody that lives in West Lafayette and they're like, oh, the canal, no, it didn't. It's all here on the south side. So the first structure of note comes up to us at the Wildcat Creek Dam and Crossing. So up there, this was incredibly crucial to Lafayette. When you had a stream or a creek in the way, you would either build a dam that would slow down the water and raise the water level up, or you would have to build some sort of an aqueduct or some sort of water bridge to go across the top of the natural stream. So the Wildcat Creek stops the Wildcat for the most part, raises the water up, and then that excess water is spilling into the canal, okay? A lot of people have a hard time imagining this, but the canal is above the river level. That's kind of crazy to think about. So because the Wildcat Creek Dam is raising the water up and spilling the water in, that's how boats could float. So this dam would supply 4,500 cubic feet of water per minute, even during the driest season. It was one of the largest water supplies to the canal in this region. All right, so that's a very important crossing up there. Then we move on to the wide water of North Lafayette. That's up, if you drive up 9th Street, you get to Oscar Winsky on your right. That's the wide water. Why do they call it that? The water was wide. There you go. So this here is a Google Maps image, and this here is the exact same footprint, but it's with LiDAR. It's where it's a type of radar where you can kind of see the terrain underneath all the foliage. But you can see this seam in the ground, right? It's like a big natural pool. And so when they were surveying the route of the canal, they weren't trying to do more work than they had to. They looked for these features, and they would direct the canal to these features, because when you don't have to dig, that's fantastic. That saves a lot of time and a lot of money, and probably a lot of snake bites and cholera as well. So this depression was 400 feet wide and about 3/4 of a mile long. What that was important for, boats could stop, they could turn around, they could dock. And then in the winter, this is my favorite part, in the winter, when the wide water froze solid, they could harvest the ice. And then they would store it for the rest of the year. Isn't that great? Nothing got wasted. I think it's private property today, so maybe not, don't go wandering around Oscar Winsky. That's probably dangerous. This is a picture of what it looks like today. very overgrown. That's what happened to most of the canal that did not turn into roads or whatever. But you will notice you have Wide Water Drive is still right down in that area. And another reason why this is so important, the canal is 40 feet wide, right? The boats are up to 80 feet long. So do you think they could turn around wherever they wanted? No, you had to wait for a wide spot before you could turn around. It's like an off ramp. So that was a really hugely important part of the canal's architecture. Then the downtown dock and basin, right through downtown, when they did the railroad relocation project, they found about 900 feet of docking area. This is where boats are leaving off goods, and there's a lot of commerce happening there. And in fact, they found a lot of artifacts here because it's a stopping point. It's like when you get off the highway to get gas and you throw away your junk. It was the same thing. They found a lot of junk, a lot of artifacts underneath the canal bed. After that, we've got some road bridges. I won't get into that too much because we're short on time, but basically every time you cross the canal, you need a bridge because you've got a waterway blocking you to the river. So there were several road bridges that came through Lafayette, notably across from Brown Street in line with Main Street as well. And at 9th Street, there was something called a change bridge, which I think is super cool. You could change the side of the canal you were walking on without having to unhook from your mules. So picture a boat coming through here. Let's see if I can make this work. Picture a boat coming through here. You got your mules. They would walk up the bridge, over the bridge, down underneath the bridge, and keep going. And you wouldn't have to unhook. Isn't that crazy? The towpath only happens on one side of the canal at a time. You don't have both sides. It's really hard to build a 10-foot wide gravel path that'll be flat. So you only have the towpath on one side at a time. And sometimes you had to switch, like they did up at 9th Street. There were several culverts. That's just an earthworks that helps cross over a stream where water is flowing out to the Wabash. Again, I'm not going to get too into that because of time, but culverts are also pretty cool. Then at Weah Creek, southwest of town, there was actually a rudimentary dam and a 100-foot long aqueduct. This is not a picture of the Weah Creek aqueduct. This is up the Eel River in Logansport. But an aqueduct is literally a water bridge. How did they build it? I have no idea, but they got it built, and I think that's incredible. It was watertight enough to float boats. The railroad relocation project, suddenly railroads weren't so much fun for Lafayette, were they? No. So they decided to relocate the railroad to get it out of the way, and the canal was out of the way. So they start to build the railroad there in 1993, move things over, and whoops, we found all sorts of historic artifacts that got to stop work. It's cost almost $500,000, which was a drop in the bucket considering the whole budget, but it's really cool because it's one of the best looks at Lafayette's canal route. They found things like shoes. They excavated here. This is kind of one of the excavation sites right along where the railroad currently runs. So, you know, if you get permission from CSX or Norfolk Southern or whoever, just go down there, look under the ties, see what you find. A penny from 1847 that TCHA let me check out. That was super fun. You can see some of the wood as they're uncovering it, some of the structures and logs. This is my personal favorite. It is a medallion from the Total Abstinence Society of Ireland, which reads, "I promise to abstain from intoxicating drinks." But what the best part is they found it in the canal. So obviously someone had a change of heart, you know. It's like, I forget this. Anyway, so they found all sorts of fun stuff in the canal there. All right, so this is at the Argonbright Center with TCHA in their upstairs area. They have some really cool stuff to check out. These are original timbers that they pulled out from right downtown. They didn't pull out every single timber. They covered it up nicely and then laid the railroad track on top. Okay, like I said, you find all sorts of random artifacts under the ground. This is actually in the basement here right below us. Different metals and products and things that were found as the archaeologists all dug around. And then with time, I'm gonna have to skip over the story of the Granville boys. Long story short, it involves alcohol. It involves an unruly crew and kind of just the wild world that the canal used to be. So I do want to share with you real briefly how you can get involved with the canal today if you're interested in checking more out. The Canal Society of Indiana, their website is endcanal.org. All these cool Google Maps things I've had on the screen, that's all from the Canal Society. They have a really cool interactive feature on their website where you can actually explore the map yourself over a modern Google map. But what's super cool is this is our best guess where the canal is. They didn't leave very good notes about where everything was. And in all the chaos, when it all closed down, no one took very good notes. So it's kind of there's still some mysteries to uncover, which I think is a lot of fun. For anybody maybe that grew up with like Indiana Jones or that sort of thing, it's like you can kind of get that archaeologist vibe going. But you can email endcanal@aol.com if you're interested in joining them. It's a great group. This here is at Shawnee Bottoms. It's a niches property in Fountain County. And you can see you got a towpath, you got the canal, and you were saying earlier, you've got the canal, you can kind of see the springs in your backyard. It's really cool that you can still see these features today. A couple years ago, we got in touch, or Ed Gaswine got in touch with us at Wabash and Erie Canal Park, and he owns some land adjacent to this structure. What is this? It's the Wildcat Creek Dam, the one I said earlier that supplied 4,500 cubic feet of water per minute. That's where it is, right there. It's so cool. And it was built of stone, so you can still see it. And there were some questions about, well, what did this structure actually look like? Where did the boats go? Where was the channel? Where did it stop? And when we go in there with our theories, we think this is how it looked. But then when you start looking at the ground, you start peering around, seeing where the channel was, it's like, wait, our hypothesis no longer makes sense. We have to retool that. And so Ed was really nice to let us hang out and kind of explore his property, get a little muddy. But in the end, I think we came to a pretty good idea of what we think was going on. Is you've got, this is the crossing bridge where the mules would walk across and pull the boats. And the dam was actually further up the Wildcat than we had previously thought, because we found some wood embedded underneath the water. That's super cool. Like, not just like a natural wood, it's like logs. It's like meant to be there. So that's really fun. But you can see out in the middle of the Wildcat when the water was low, these are metal structures. So that would have been in the middle of the bridge. So it's always fun to look, at this GPS map and you think, oh, that's about where the canal was. I wonder if that's related. So it really sparks the imagination, which is a lot of fun. Dr. Christopher Moore from the University of Indianapolis is doing some exploration as we speak. Well, I'm sure he's eating dinner right now, but he's still doing exploration up north of Delphi, which is work that has not been done before. There's so much of this history that just has been left in the ground and not bothered with. And so it's exciting to see exploration happening. So I'll just kind of leave off here with Wabash and Erie Canal Park. It's where I work. We would love to see you there anytime. It is the last remaining navigable portion of the Wabash and Erie Canal left in the entire state. It has been completely lost, or mostly lost, everywhere else in the state. You cannot just take a boat and float down the canal anymore, anywhere in Indiana, after having hundreds of miles at one point, except for this little section we got right here. And we're really proud of it. It was really gross 50 years ago. It was really bad. You had mosquitoes, you had people throwing their trash in there. It was left to the elements. And 50 years ago, some crazy people in Delphi said, let's see if we can clean this up and make it something to be proud of. And so we got historic structures like the Reed Case House. These are the same house, by the way. So we moved it about a mile across town. It was not anything to write home about, but this is the home of the guy that oversaw construction of the canal from Delphi to Lafayette, also in Miami County. And so we restored his home so you can see how the rich people lived in the 1850s. We've restored some historic bridges. The canal is beautiful to go down in a non-motorized vehicle or in our replica canal boat. So you can take a ride with us any Saturday afternoon during canal season, which runs through mid-September, to kind of get a feel for what it was like to travel on this beautiful historic waterway. We got an RV campground. We've got some historic log cabins. Again, none of those were there originally. They were all moved here or reassembled. So it's a really amazing part of what a community can do when they decide to remember our heritage and preserve it and save it for others to enjoy and learn from. And like I said, it's a volunteer organization. I'm the only staff person there full-time. I think John was here. He got out before I could embarrass him. But there's a lot of volunteers that make this a very special place indeed. So yeah, come out and see us sometime. We got trails and outdoors open dawn to dusk year round. And here are some ways you can connect with us. Happy if you want to email me anytime. Look us up on social media, Wabash and Erie Canal Park. We're on all the platforms. We're even on TikTok. We're not proud of it. We heard that's what the young kids were. But anyway, so yeah, please do get in touch with us, and we'd love to talk with you more. I was close. I was close. I was close. Thank you. So does anyone have any questions? I went a little bit long, but any good? Okay, yeah, question. Let's go for it.
You're gonna tell the captain's story.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to try to summarize it real quick? I can summarize it a bit. Okay,
We got time.
we got time. All right. Well, I do enjoy this story. So this is actually an account that was written in the Attica Daily Ledger in 1902. It was told by a man who had once been the captain of a freight boat called the Albert Ross. And this boat would make daily runs between Attica and Lafayette. It's like not unlike a truck today. You get a load, you deliver it to where it belongs, you get a load at the other place to bring back. You're just going back and forth. That's your whole job when the canal is open. Well, he's telling the story of as they're going along from Attica to Lafayette, it wasn't uncommon to see someone along the bank who might want to ride. And it's like, who cares? We have 100 tons on this thing. One more person ain't going to make a difference. So they had a group of guys. They were from Granville. You guys know where Granville is? It's okay. Most of you do. Yeah. So southwest of Lafayette. And they said, could we get a ride back to Granville? And they say, yeah, sure, come aboard. And the captain was feeling extra generous. And he said, how about you guys have lunch with us? We just have cold food here. Want to have some lunch? And they said, oh, thank you so much. They had their lunch, had a great time, and they kept along their merry way. Now the crew is working on the boat. They're busy. They can't babysit everybody on the boat. So the passengers that are just riding along happen to find out that this boat is no ordinary canal boat. It is transporting goods from a distillery in Attica for delivery up in Lafayette. And they happen to find a barrel with a loose, or they're able to loosen the plug on the barrel. And they so happen to have a little bottle with a string, and they dip it in there, and they just start having fun. The crew doesn't realize there's an issue until, I want to make sure I can read this right. They didn't notice the problem until the riders were, quote, rude and offensive in manners. So when they came to their stopping place, they said, okay, thanks, have a great day, see you later. So the next boat trip, they're going back to Lafayette again. They've gone back, they go back to Lafayette, same group. And they're like, well, okay, it's fine. We're just walking. Same exact thing happens. Same exact thing. Those Granville boys were trouble. And then the next boat trip, third time's the charm. The free riders were having so much fun, and they must have been able to keep their manners enough. They rode all the way to Lafayette with the crew, of course, enjoying their ride thoroughly. So they get to Lafayette, and the crew kind of parts ways. The captain's like, hey, you guys unload the ship. I'm going to go stay with a rich friend I have. So the captain goes to stay with a marble merchant here in Lafayette. And as he's having a pleasant dinner with this marble merchant, the merchant's wife says, hey, I'm going to Attica tomorrow, and I'm going to take a packet boat to get down there. And our friend, the captain, is very gentlemanly. He says, how about you give me your trunk, give me your carriage, I'll take all your stuff. So that way you can just go with your child and not have to worry about all your stuff. And so the lady said, oh, that's so nice. Thank you for doing that. So the next morning, he's got his stuff. He's going back to his boat to load it up to do a favor for his friend. And he'll get all the lady's stuff back to her when they get back to Attica. But when he gets to the boat, he sees that the load he's supposed to take back to Attica that day is just sitting next to the boat. It hasn't been loaded. His crew is nowhere to be found. The mules are also nowhere to be found. And he has a boat with no mules and no crew. And so he ends up finding out that his crew had decided to spend the evening with our Granville boy friends. And they had quite a time. They were locked up for drunkenness and disorderly conduct. And they must have done some property damage along the way because there were fines and costs associated with these shenanigans. And the mule team had been confiscated by the authorities. And so the captain has to go on this whole crazy chase running around town trying to find the authorities, people who have connections, and to say, hey, that's not their mules, that's my mules. So you guys need to chill out a little bit. And so after some jockeying and some arguing, finessing, they ended up saying, okay, we'll give you back your mules, but you need to garnish the wages of these crew members until they've paid back what they owe. And so the crew members then, they get back on the boat. They felt really sad, really bad. The Granville boys, no, don't worry, good citizens. They remained in jail. They did not get bailed out. So over time, the crew did pay off their fines. And the final note the captain leaves us with is that they felt so bad about paying out hard-earned money so uselessly that they decided to let whiskey alone from that time forth. Now, did they really let whiskey alone from that time forth? I don't know. I don't know. It was a crazy time. But that's the story of, yeah, that's what's going on. So thanks for sharing. Yeah. Thank you.
How often did they change out mules?
How often do they change out mules? That's a great question. On a freight boat like this, you would often have a mule team on board and a mule team walking. And every 12 to 15 miles, whatever it exactly was, the mules would switch. So they would stop the boat, put out a gangplank, and I would love to have seen video of how they got mules to walk across a gangplank. But so they would bring the fresh mules out and they'd take the tired mules back aboard to rest. And they just go that way, swapping back and forth. So we say that mules are stubborn. It's not that they're stubborn. It's that they know, yeah, they know when their turn's done and they're not going another step. If you were on a passenger boat, it was kind of like Hertz Rent-A-Mule. Like there would be a network of relay barns. And so you pull to the next station, 12 or 15 miles, and then you swap for fresh mules and leave them off at that station and you keep going. So there was a separate entity that was dealing with, because no one wants to ride with the mules if you're paying for passenger service. But on a freight boat, you're just stuck with it.
Well, you know, it makes me think, remember that old song we learned in elementary school?
Yes, the mule named Sal.
Her name is Sal, 15 miles on the Erie Canal. So maybe 15 miles was.
That's a good. Oh yeah,
Sal's shift.
Yeah, that's Sal's shift, and Sal's not going to walk another foot more than Sal has to. Yes. Yeah. Question.
Can you give us a clue, an idea of the Wildcat Dam? I don't think I ever saw that. Now, there was an aqueduct or a viaduct north of Delphi, and I saw that.
Mm-hmm.
Where was the Wildcat? I grew up in western Howard County on Wildcat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's located fairly close to where the Wildcat meets the Wabash River.
Here at 65?
Yeah, right near 65.
Okay.
If you were to be the best place really to see it is if you're driving across Schuyler Avenue and the water's low,
Yeah.
you can see some of those structures out in the middle of the creek.
Well, okay.
Yeah. And I would also say for any time when you go exploring, you look at the Canal Society's really cool GPS map. Always do try to check with the property owner because a lot of it does pass through private property nowadays. So always check. But yes, the Wildcat Creek, you can see it from Schuyler Avenue looking north, at least in the middle. Yeah.
I presume there's two-way traffic on this. How did she work out the move?
Yes, that is an excellent question. And I'm not sure if I have a good picture to really explain it. So I'll just try to pretend. So you've got two-way traffic, or sometimes a faster boat would have to pass over a slower boat. How do you do that? And there were rules about who had to stop, who has the right of way, who gets to keep going. So if you were the boat that had to stop, you would take your mules would walk away from the water and stop, kind of off the towpath, like they're pulling over. You would steer your boat away from the mules. So you're kind of going to the edges, the outer edges of the water and the towpath. The boat that's continuing on past you, their mules would walk on the inside of the towpath, and you would steer your boat on the inside of the water. And so when the boat stopped, the rope would fall down to the bottom of the canal. And then the moving boat would your mules would step over the rope and go on from there. Yep. So it was possible, but it was tedious. Yeah.
Who actually manage construction? I mean, you can't just have people out there digging. They have to have where you're going, how they get paid, how they get fed.
Yes.
Who did that?
So the state contracted out sections to contractors. And so then it was up to the contractors to build segments of the canal. The state also employed a guy named Jesse Williams, who was he was like the overseer, the engineer's engineer. And he was overseeing a lot of the more important structures, the more complicated constructions. I really love Jesse Williams because when they built a dam at Pittsburgh, right across from Delphi, and this was a dam across the entire Wabash River. Imagine doing this in 1840. 600-foot long dam. They're trying to raise the Wabash River. I think it was either 6 or 8 feet. That's a big task. And he wanted to prove that the Irishmen working, they don't need whiskey to get the job done, and that alcohol is an evil that we can stamp out. And so he made sure the construction was done whiskey free, and it got done. And he was hoping that would have an impact and it didn't. It didn't have any impact. But the dam was built whiskey-free, at least according to Jesse Williams. So, but yeah.
Two questions. Quickly, I thought it was an aqueduct, but apparently it's a culvert north of upstream and on the north side of the river.
Mhm.
In your county.
Yes,
Is that still got the county road running over it? Still
it
there?
does. Yeah. So in Delphi, did I already pass it? Yes, right here, the Burnett's Creek Arch. So it's easy to confuse the two. An aqueduct is like a freestanding bridge, usually made of wood in this area. A culvert is more an arch that you build earthworks over the top and let the water flow underneath. This is just north of Delphi. It is the Burnett's Creek Arch, and it's a county road now. So instead of floating over it, you drive over it. But it is still the oldest continuously operating bridge in the state. It's almost 200 years old, and those stones are the same ones that were put there by the workers in 1840 or 1839. And the timbers underneath the bridge are the same timbers that were laid there almost 200 years ago. It's
And if I
pretty amazing.
remember correctly, there's no mortar.
That's a good question.
I don't think there is. I think.
What was the question?
Oh, the question was about this structure here. Was it an aqueduct? Was it a culvert? And so I've always seen it referred to as a culvert because of its construction, but it's located just north of Delphi, near the town of Lockport. Oh, second question.
My other question, I've read a fair amount and not seen the answer to this one.
Uh-oh.
It seems to me like it would have made more sense to terminate the south end of the canal either here or Attica and go to Wabash River Steamboat.
Yes, one thing.
Reason, you know, why they didn't do that?
Yes, so one thing I have not talked about is the financial end of the canal. It was a big burden for the state, especially the section Terre Haute to Evansville. Never really saw a lot of financial return. They would have been much better off ending the canal towards Lafayette or towards Terre Haute. So what happened? The original plan was to just bridge the gap for steamboats to do most of the work, to get from the head of navigation of the Wabash, about in Lafayette or Americus, up past Fort Wayne. So what happened? Well, there were land grants. The federal government kept dangling carrots out in front of Indiana saying, hey, if you go a little further, you know, you can have this land. And so that was part of it. Another part of it is as the canal is extending and you got all these people seeing their lives radically changed, you don't want to be the representative that tells their constituents, no, we don't need it this far. We're fine. We'll figure something out. We'll wait for the railroads to develop. You know, you want to be the one to get stuff done to get reelected. So it was kind of a case of, you know, government projects move like an oil tanker. You know, there's not a whole lot of quickly changing course. But it is said that when the canal reached Terre Haute, and that's where it was going to stop at that point, and they said, hey, we're going to Evansville. Nobody was more surprised than Jesse Williams, the guy who was going to have to build it. So it was all kind of a great case of politics and sometimes politicians setting goals that maybe the engineers should be involved in setting.
If I remember correctly, from at least Terre Haute, maybe from Attica, that part of the canal never made enough money to pay for maintenance.
Exactly. So once they got to Evansville, they said, new plan. If your section of the canal is not paying for its own maintenance, we're shutting it down. And within less than a decade, basically Terre Haute to Evansville was no longer running. So it was a very foolish idea to go that far. I mean, I don't mind still being able to say we built the second longest canal in human history. That's cool. But economically speaking, not a super great idea. You're right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know anything about this Terry Lacy that did this and a few other
Oh,
paintings? Is that someone with
yes.
the Canal Society?
So Terry Lacy, he's a local artist around the Delphi area. We love Terry. He's the best. Most of the stuff we have at our park was painted by Terry. And here's the problem we found. When we're trying to interest people in canal history, here's what happens. They say, it's all very abstract. We can't see it. We can't imagine it. And seeing those pictures really sparks the imagination. When we see a fourth grader that comes in and looks at this painting, it's like, oh, this nice boat on a stream. And they're like, oh no, the stream's down here. This is water going perpendicular over water. Like, and they can't process it. And then you explain how this was built, how it was engineered. And they're like, wow, that's so cool. So a huge obstacle we had was how do we create these visuals? Because they don't exist. We don't have the same pop culture base to work from that, say, the railroad enthusiasts have. We're not jealous of the railroad people, but we are. So Terry did a great job of working in tandem with the historians to try to take all these words and these engineering reports and to turn it into a picture. So we love Terry. Yeah.
No, but you have a lot of volunteers and it's been, the whole part has been manned by volunteers for a lot of years. But the museum seems to be professionally done.
Yes. The museum was designed by a man named Len Meislewick. He's a designer from Fort Wayne. He actually got his, earlier in his career, he was a toy designer. And so when he came to us and pitched building the museum or his designing for the museum, he said, I'll make sure that it's interactive, that it's hands-on, that it'll draw kids in. When we have school tours come and we tell the teachers, we're going to be in the museum for about an hour. And the teachers are like, oh, good heavens, they don't know my students. But at the end of the hour, we're dragging the kids out because there's too much fun stuff to play with. So yeah, Len Meislewick was the designer. And then our volunteers did the building of the exhibits where they would just follow the blueprints. And so I would, again, if you are interested in learning more or like participating with us, come talk to me. We're always looking for new volunteers. We will put you on that canal boat, even if you have no nautical experience. It is a lot of fun. And if you're into some of the historic trades and want to participate in one of the historic cabins, we'd love to see you there. It's a really fun place to be. Yeah.
Another mule question.
Mhm.
I can't visualize what the harnesses would look like because, you hitch the mules to the front of the boat
Mhm.
and they're gonna tend to pull the boat over, the bow of the boat over towards it. So they must have had a specialized harness of some sort.
So we have some example harnesses in the museum, but a big key is that they were not tied to the nose up the bow. They were actually tied partway down the boat, like midway or 2/3 of the way up. And that kept so you weren't just going into the bank nonstop. Plus there was a steersman who'd be working at the back with kind of like we call a tiller. It's just like a big rudder, manually operated. So the boat we use today is not mule operated, full disclosure, don't want you to be disappointed. We operate with some rechargeable electric batteries because they don't eat and they don't poop. So, yeah.
I've heard a couple stories, Mike, but I'm not sure they're true. Maybe you can clarify.
Oh.
About the construction of the
Mhm.
canal, mostly Irish, or at least a lot of Irish.
Yes.
But during that construction, which was extremely difficult and extremely challenging for so many, but was there some real stories about maybe religion entering into the difficulties between some Irish?
Oh, yes. So that was, I didn't get into that tonight because most of that happened north of us,
Oh,
up towards like LaGros and Huntington area.
oh,
But there was a couple different Irish factions that had some long simmering issues from back home. And so the work crews would be separated based on which group you identified with to make sure to keep the fighting down to a minimum. There were still skirmishes. At one point, there was a really big skirmish that did erupt and the state had to send in like militias and stuff to break it up. And it stopped work. So yes, that was a real thing.
and was whiskey used to calm some of those people down?
Whiskey was part of the pay package. That is true. Workers were paid with, I can't remember how many, it's a little bit less than a shot. I think it's like an ounce or an ounce and a half. I think the unit's called a jigger. And so you drink, I think you get a double portion on Sunday, by the way, because it's the Lord's Day. You got to enjoy it. And I read an account where the newspaper had interviewed one of these bosses, the people that's distributing whiskey, keeping the workers semi-drunk just about all the time, or a lot of the time. And he said, don't you have moral issues with you're intoxicating these men doing this dangerous work? And his response was, well, you wouldn't do this work sober, would you? You kind of had a point. Yeah, I guess one more. Yeah.
State
Oh, sure.
religion, the Irish, as I understand, predominant.
Uh-huh.
And they were Roman Catholic. They were in this bunch considered illiterate and so forth. And they said, there was no church. They didn't have religious service. And so they got to Lafayette and there were 25, supposedly 25 Irishmen that got together and got permission from the bishop in Vincent, get a priest, and they built a church, the first Catholic church in town, just down the street here. And around the northeast corner of, Brown and Fifth Streets.
There you go.
And there's now a memorial plaque. to
Oh, great.
Commemorating that.
That's awesome. And I'd say that the canal did bring a lot of those firsts to Lafayette. We have an influx of, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. That's very cool. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for coming this evening. If you do have any questions, if you'd like to talk with me about participating at the park, supporting the park in one way or another, definitely please come visit us in Delphi. There's a table with some postcards you're free to take, some brochures, our schedule, my business card. We'd love to see you sometime up in Delphi. All right. Thank you. Yeah, we're